You don't remember your first burn. Not exactly. You only remember the way your hand jerked, how the tongs slipped, how the world went white-hot and blurry, and how your father didn't even turn his head. He just said, flatly, "Told you not to touch that." That's how it started. No ceremony, no grand forge lighting, no legendary hammer passed down from the gods. Just smoke, sweat, and the realization that this was your life now, and would be, until the very end. Now, let's pull back. Because this wasn't just your life, it was the life of thousands, the nameless blacksmiths of the medieval world, whose stories were never recorded, but whose scars told all. For most smiths in the Middle Ages, the profession wasn't chosen, it was inherited. If your father bent iron for a living, you bent with him. Not out of love for the craft, but because the guilds, the laws, and frankly, your stomach, gave you no other choice. In a world where social mobility was nearly impossible, a child born to a blacksmith was expected to die a blacksmith. The forge wasn't a job, it was a bloodline, and it started young. We're not talking teenage apprenticeships here. Medieval boys, sometimes girls too, though they were rarer, began learning the basics by age 5 or 6. That meant hauling coal, stoking fires, running errands, and pumping the bellows until their arms trembled. These were not chores. These were tests of patience, of obedience, of endurance. Formal apprenticeships, according to surviving guild records from the 1300s, often began at age 7 and lasted up to a decade. Imagine that. By the time you turned 17, you'd already spent 10 full years in a forge. That's over 3,000 days of iron, fire, and bruised fingers. Long before you knew how to write your own name, you could recite the steps for hardening steel. Was it harsh? Yes, but no one saw it that way. Back then, childhood wasn't a protected period. It was a proving ground, and blacksmithing was among the roughest tests a child could endure. There were no safety protocols, no ear protection, no reinforced gloves. If you burned yourself, you learned not to do that again. If you dropped a hot horseshoe and it clipped your ankle, well, hopefully you'd remember the pain the next time. Teaching by trauma, education by repetition. Your mentor, more often than not, was your own father, or your uncle, or a neighbor who owed your family a favor. He likely had missing teeth, a bad temper, and a firm belief that discipline came not from books, but from a sharp word and a swifter cuff to the back of the head. Apprenticeship was less about guidance and more about survival. Some days you carried coal. Some days you watched. And some days, on those cursed days, you were told to try it yourself. That meant gripping a tool too heavy for your hand, striking a surface you didn't understand, and bracing for whatever mistake came next. And there were always mistakes. That was part of it. But not all of it was pain. There was something else, too. A strange, quiet pride that began to grow, not in your chest, but in your calluses. You started to understand the rhythm of the fire, the hiss when water hit metal, the moment when a bar of iron stopped resisting and began to yield. You could feel it, not just see it. That's when you stopped being a child, even if your age still said otherwise. Not when your voice cracked, not when your first beard grew, but when your muscles ached at night for a job done decently. In time, your role changed. You weren't just fetching or watching anymore. You were expected to work, really work. The 10-year-old apprentice became the 13-year-old striker. You stood beside your master and brought the hammer down where he pointed. You timed your swings with his. You moved in sync like dancers, But if dancers routinely swung 20 pounds of iron in a room full of sparks and molten metal? Let's pause here just for a moment, because while today's teenagers worry about test scores and internships, their medieval counterparts were already halfway through a career they never asked for, already stiff in the joints, already short of breath from years of soot and heat. There's an old saying in smithing: the metal doesn't care how tired you are. Neither did the guilds, or the town, or the customers banging on your door before sunrise. Once you were in, you were in. There was no quitting the forge unless you lost a hand, or your will to live. And even then, someone would probably ask if you could still pump the bellows with your foot. Some blacksmiths did rise in the ranks. A few gained prestige, opened their own shops, or joined respected guilds. But even those successes were built on the same backbone: long hours, relentless physical labor, and pain. Always the pain. By 17, you had more practical experience than most modern college graduates. You could repair a plow, shoe a horse, sharpen a blade, and fix a broken axle, all before lunch. But while your skill grew, so did the wear. Your spine already carried a permanent curve. Your lungs, scarred from years of breathing forge smoke, coughed quietly when you thought no one was listening. You didn't complain. You didn't even think to. This was just life. And life, for a medieval blacksmith, started early and aged you quickly. The sun didn't rise for you. Not really. By the time its light slipped through the wooden slats above your forge, you'd already been awake for hours. The fire was hot. The coals were hissing. Your arms were moving, not with energy, but with habit. A medieval blacksmith's day didn't begin with a bell or a rooster's cry. It began with the breath of the forge. Deep, steady, and always hungry. It had to be coaxed awake like a living thing, fed slowly with scraps of yesterday's coal and the whisper of bellows, until its heat was strong enough to bend metal and melt reason. You worked with your back to the sun, facing the fire. Time didn't pass by the hour. It passed by the number of nails made, horses shod, or plowshares shaped. You could measure it in hammer blows if you were poetic enough to care. But there was nothing poetic about the heat. The average forge needed to maintain temperatures between 1,500 and 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Enough to melt lead. Enough to scald flesh from bone in an instant. You learned to respect the glow of iron, not because it was beautiful, but because it could erase you. And in the summer, the forge turned from an inferno into something worse. A kind of dry, smoky hell that crept under your skin. You'd sweat so much that the floor beneath your feet had to be designed to drain it. That's not exaggeration. Archaeological digs have found sloped forge floors with channels, not for rain, but for human perspiration. Your shirt, if you wore one, would be soaked through by midday. Many smiths worked bare-chested, not out of pride or vanity, but survival. A thick wool tunic could trap enough heat to make you faint. Some did. Faint, that is, and not always at convenient times. There are records of blacksmiths collapsing mid-swing, their hammer landing off-mark, sending a half-formed horseshoe flying across the shop. If it hit someone, that was their bad luck. If it didn't, you kept working. Breaks were rare. Lunch was whatever you could chew quickly enough between heating cycles. A hunk of bread, maybe. A sip of ale that tasted more like ash than barley. Food wasn't fuel, it was interruption. And if summer was cruel, winter was crueler in a different way. Outside, frost covered everything. But inside, your forge glowed like the sun. The problem was the contrast. Your front would roast while your back stayed frozen. Move too far from the fire, and your joints locked up. Get too close, and your eyelashes curled. Sometimes the condensation from your breath would freeze on your beard, only to melt again when you turned back to the flame. It wasn't a cozy kind of warmth. It was a battleground between extremes. Medieval blacksmiths were always caught between fire and frost. Touching your tools in winter came with its own hazards. Iron froze fast. If you grabbed a tool bare-handed, your skin might stick. Then, just a second later, the heat of the forge would warm it enough to burn. First frozen, then blistered, like a twisted game of temperature roulette. And still, the hammer kept swinging. A busy smith might strike the anvil thousands of times per day. Think of that. The same motion, over and over, your shoulder joint absorbing every jolt, your grip tightening around a handle wrapped in soaked leather. The repetition wore you down, not just physically, but mentally. Every strike had to count. Miss the angle and you waste time, or worse, ruin the piece entirely. You learned to read the iron. Not in words, of course, but in color. A deep red meant it was still too cold. Yellow-orange meant ready. White, dangerous. Too hot, too fragile. Like anger, iron had a point where it couldn't be reasoned with. You'd listen too, not with your ears, but your bones. The sound of metal against metal told you everything. A dull thud, you were losing heat. A sharp ring, you were in the zone. It was almost music, if music could scar your hands. The forge was both teacher and tormentor. And all of this, every drop of sweat, every ache, every burn, was for people who usually didn't thank you. In fact, they rarely noticed you. To them, the iron just existed, fixed, sharpened, ready. They didn't see the hours it took, the burns, the practice, the midnight repairs, the sheer cost of making something right. But you noticed. You always noticed. You noticed the weight in your own limbs, the heat radiating from your chest long after you left the workshop, the smell of coal embedded in your hair, the phantom ring of the anvil still echoing in your ears, even in silence. You also noticed how your hands began to change. Your grip stiffened. Your skin hardened. You couldn't feel small things anymore. Not really. Picking up a needle? Good luck. You weren't made for detail. You were made for force. Your sleep changed too. Not in quality. There was no quality, but in rhythm. Some nights you collapsed before dinner. Others, you lay awake with your arm twitching involuntarily, your body trying to hammer even in rest. There were times, brief but vivid, when you thought about doing something else. Anything else. Farming, maybe. Woodcutting, even fishing. But then you'd remember, your arms were wrong for that now. Your lungs too. And anyway, what would you do with all this heat inside you? So you got up, and you worked, because the fire didn't care how you felt, and neither did the customers, and someone, somewhere, needed something fixed before market day. You didn't just make things out of iron. You made time behave. You made chaos orderly. And that perhaps was the cruelest part. For all the punishment, for all the silence and sweat and bruises and burns, you never made anything that lasted longer than people's memory of needing it. But you still showed up, because the forge was waiting. And so was the world. The body doesn't forget. Even when the mind learns to push through the aches, even when the routine becomes second nature, your bones remember. Your muscles record every strike. And over time, the forge doesn't just shape metal. It shapes you. A medieval blacksmith didn't age like other people. He wore the years in the curve of his spine, in the way his right arm hung slightly lower than the left, heavier from decades of hammer work. One shoulder higher, one hip tilted. A quiet twist that told you who he was before he even picked up the tongs. Archaeological remains confirm it. Skeletal evidence from medieval burial sites shows that blacksmiths often had enlarged muscle attachments, places where tendon met bone, grown thick from constant strain. Vertebrae compressed, joints swollen. The anvil wasn't just part of the workshop. It was carved slowly and silently into the man himself. And then there were the hands. A smith's hands were tools in their own right. Thick, scarred, often numb. Calluses built so deep that they could press a hot iron for a half-second too long before feeling the burn. Fingertips lost sensitivity. Palms cracked from repeated strain and exposure to heat, cold, and sweat. A modern surgeon might call it neuropathy. The blacksmith just called it Thursday. But numbness wasn't the only problem. There was the hearing loss too. No earplugs, no barriers, just the constant ringing of hammer against steel, steel against anvil, anvil against earth. The sound didn't stop when the work did. Many smiths experienced a phantom ringing long after the forge had gone dark for the night. For some, it never went away. Eyes, too, paid their price. Sparks flew in every direction. Tiny flakes of iron, invisible in motion, lodged themselves into corneas. Over time, vision blurred, accuracy suffered, and when the eyes failed, the hands had to compensate, feeling heat, estimating shape, guessing texture. The body adapted, even as it deteriorated. And still the work continued. Blacksmiths rarely stopped working due to injury. They worked around it. A burned hand meant favoring the other. A twisted ankle meant shifting stance. A cracked rib, well, that just meant working slower that day. There was no compensation, no time off. Pain was part of the job description, written in sweat and soot. Even rest offered no real comfort. Beds in medieval times weren't kind to broken bodies. A straw mattress did little to soothe a shoulder worn raw from hammer swings. And when your muscles cooled overnight, they stiffened like cooling metal. Getting up in the morning wasn't waking. It was reheating. Reigniting the body so it could survive another day near the flame. Some developed permanent tremors, not the kind caused by fear, but by fatigue so deep it lived in the joints. A shaking hand was just part of the package. You learned to grip harder. You aimed anyway. You did the work. And then there were the internal wounds, the ones no one could see. The lungs were first to falter. Each breath in the forge was a gamble. Coal dust, charcoal ash, particulate iron. You inhaled them all, and they didn't leave. No masks, no filters. Just black residue building slowly in the folds of lung tissue, layering itself like sediment in a riverbed. Some smiths developed a constant cough. Others wheezed only after work. But for many, it crept in unnoticed, until climbing stairs left them breathless, or laughing hurt more than it healed. Forge lung, some called it. Others didn't call it anything. They just kept working. Carbon monoxide was a silent killer too, colorless, odorless. It built up slowly in small enclosed shops, especially in winter when doors stayed shut and ventilation was poor. Dizziness, headaches, confusion. These symptoms were common and easily ignored. Just tired, they'd say. Just hungry. And sometimes they were, sometimes they weren't. And then there was lead. Not all smiths worked with iron alone. Some specialized in alloys, bronze, brass, pewter. These required lead, tin, and copper. The fumes from melting these metals were subtle, but dangerous. Neurological damage, tremors, memory loss. For a man whose life depended on precision, lead exposure was a betrayal. His hands would forget what they once knew. Even the skin couldn't escape. Constant exposure to soot, oil, acidic compounds, combined with repeated burns, left skin scarred, discolored, and in some cases, chronically inflamed. One surviving medical text from the 14th century describes a treatment for Smith's sores involving the crushed herbs, egg white, and honey. It probably helped, but not enough. And yet, for all this wear, all this slow unmaking of the body, the blacksmith kept going, because the work wasn't just hard, it was constant. There was no off-season, no slower quarter, no time to heal. When the fields froze over and farmers rested, the blacksmith still had orders. When soldiers marched off to war, they left behind blades that needed sharpening and armor that needed fixing. The smith worked while others waited, and in that relentless rhythm, the body suffered. But strangely, it also adapted. You learned how to shift your weight just right, how to swing with your hips instead of your shoulder, how to brace your elbow against your ribs on long hammer runs. These weren't tricks. They were necessities, little acts of mercy to keep your body from breaking entirely. It wasn't enough, of course. Eventually, the body always broke. It just took longer. Retirement wasn't a concept. Most smiths worked until their hands could no longer grip. Some passed the forge to sons or apprentices. Others just stopped showing up. When they died, it was rarely with fanfare. Their tools were used by the next in line. Their name faded. Their scars were not remembered. But their work was. The tools they forged, the gates they built, the nails, the swords, the wheels, all those things outlasted them. Some still do, found in ruins, hung in museums, buried in fields, silent evidence of a body that paid for its legacy in pain. And for a blacksmith, that was enough. You'd think that a man who could bend iron would earn a little respect, that someone who could summon fire, shape steel, and mend the bones of wagons and swords alike might be spoken to with patience, with gratitude, maybe even a hint of admiration. But the truth? Most blacksmiths were treated like servants with hot tools, and their customers, well, they weren't always kind. The first thing to understand is that everyone needed a blacksmith. There was no one else who could do what he did. Farmers needed plows, hoes, hinges. Soldiers needed swords, spear tips, armor clasps. Merchants needed wheel rims and axles. Horsemen needed shoes. Even the church needed bells and locks and iron candelabras. And they all needed them now. The medieval blacksmith lived under constant pressure, not because his work was hard, but because everyone acted like their work was the priority. Every customer thought their request was urgent, sacred, above the rest. And in the absence of digital cues or polite scheduling, urgency translated into noise. Loud knocking, yelling through windows, standing at the forge's edge while you worked, arms crossed, foot tapping. There are historical complaints in guild records, actual complaints, filed by blacksmiths who were harassed by nobles, merchants, even monks, for not working fast enough. One poor smith in 15th century London was held at dagger point by a nobleman who was late to a hunting party. The horse wasn't even fully shoed. "Just finish the job," the man said, quickly. And then there were the experts, the ones who had supposedly seen better work somewhere else. My uncle's friend in the next county hammers faster than that. Or, that doesn't look like how a sword should curve. Unsolicited advice, delivered with confidence and zero understanding. You couldn't argue. You needed the coin, or, more accurately, whatever passed for coin that week. Because here's the other problem. Most customers didn't pay in money. Cash was rare in rural areas. Coins passed hands occasionally, but for the blacksmith, income usually came with feathers, fur, or a root cellar smell. You might shoe 3 horses and receive a wheel of cheese, some firewood, and a promise that more hay is coming next week. You couldn't eat promises, but you couldn't eat iron either. So you learned to smile, to barter, to calculate how many cabbages a shovel might be worth, or how many chickens could equal the cost of a reworked blade. A blacksmith wasn't just a metal worker. He was a small-scale trader, a reluctant accountant, and an unwilling debt collector. And those debts, they lingered. Records from Germantown ledgers in the 14th century show smiths with unpaid accounts stretching back decades. Tally sticks, scratched ledgers, notched tokens. Sometimes the debt died with the customer. Sometimes it was passed down to their children. Imagine explaining to a 12-year-old that his father still owes you 3 sheep and a hoe repair. You couldn't demand repayment, not from the nobility. If a lord wanted a sword, he got a sword. Maybe he'd pay. Maybe he'd bless your shop or protect your walls from thieves. Services you didn't ask for, in return for work, you couldn't refuse. Refusing a nobleman wasn't an option anyway, not if you valued your teeth, or your forge, or your life. The church? Slightly better, but only slightly. The clergy might promise prayer in return for tools, holy exchanges, they'd say, as if a blessing would put food on your table or coal in your bucket. And still, you said yes, because saying no could mean losing your reputation. And once that was gone, so was everything else. The social pressure wasn't always loud, but it was always there. You were expected to be useful, fast, fair, and silent. You were expected to undercharge the wealthy, forgive the debts of the poor, and absorb every mistake as your own. If a wagon wheel broke under the weight of poor packing, you were blamed for weak iron. If a sword snapped in battle after being parried against a stone wall, it was your fault for shoddy forging. If a tool rusted after weeks of rain, well, why didn't you make it rainproof? Even children weren't off limits. There are records, real ones, of blacksmiths being held responsible for injuries caused by tools they'd crafted years earlier. A child misused a pruning hook and lost a toe. Clearly the fault of the smith, who should have warned the parents better. As if smiths were fortune tellers, responsible not just for forging iron, but for predicting how idiots would use it. And if all else failed, the customer could take their complaints to the local magistrate, who, let's be honest, was usually a merchant or a nobleman or someone who bought things from you regularly. In that courtroom, the sooty-handed man in a leather apron didn't stand much of a chance against the silk-tongued tradesman who lost a wagon wheel. Some blacksmiths were even forced to swear oaths on relics that their work wasn't deliberately flawed. Imagine that, being hauled into a church, placed before the bones of a saint, and asked to swear that your horseshoe didn't bend on purpose, because that's how much people trusted the tools and mistrusted the hands that made them. And yet, you kept working. You kept your voice even, your posture calm. You didn't argue, even when your heart burned hotter than the forge. You understood something they didn't. That metal is unforgiving. It cracks when mistreated. It warps when left in the cold. It rusts when forgotten. Just like people. And so, you learned to let the complaints wash over you like soot in your hair. You couldn't scrub it all out, but eventually you stopped noticing. You just kept hammering because the wheel still needed mending. The plow still needed sharpening. And somewhere, outside, someone was already walking toward your door, ready to shout that they'd been waiting long enough. By now, you've probably guessed that coin wasn't your reward. Not most days. A blacksmith in the Middle Ages didn't wait in line to deposit silver into a chest. There was no tidy purse tied to his belt, no gleaming reward after a week's worth of hammering. Your payment had feathers, or leaves, or legs. One day, it was a goose. The next, a sack of turnips so bruised they already looked half-eaten. If you were lucky, someone brought ale. If you were really lucky, it hadn't gone sour. This was the truth of your income. Inconsistent, improvised, and constantly in danger of spoiling, running off, or being traded away too soon. You might spend half a day fixing a plow, perfectly aligning the metal so it won't catch in soil, and your reward is a half-wheel of cheese and the promise of some firewood sometime before the frost. And somehow you nod, smile, wipe your hands, say, "That'll do," because it has to. Records from medieval tax ledgers show that up to 70% of blacksmith income came in non-monetary form. Goods, services, IOUs scribbled on bone or scratched into wood. You became an accidental merchant, bartering for bread, for soap, for boots that wouldn't fall apart in the rain. Sometimes you traded your trades. Fix a wheel, get a chicken. Trade the chicken for eggs. Trade the eggs for salt. Trade the salt for a length of wool to patch your cloak. Trade what's left of the wool for a few onions so your stew won't taste like sadness. And what happens if one trade fails? Well, there goes dinner. In this way, your work never really ended. Even after the forge cooled, your brain kept turning. What can I swap for what? What can I carry? What will spoil? What will feed the family until next week? And that family, they didn't eat iron. They ate what you could scramble together from a world that seemed determined to pay you in anything but certainty. Some customers meant well. They truly did. They'd bring you their best goat cheese, still warm in the wrapping, or fresh herbs they'd gathered that morning. You smiled and you meant it. But those moments were rare. More often they came with excuses. Next market day, I swear. We didn't slaughter the pig yet. My cousin still has your hay. I'll fetch it once the rains pass. Promises filled your ears, your ledger, your doorway, but rarely your stomach. And let's talk about winter, because winter wasn't just cold. It was hungry. There were no crops. The goats gave less milk. The eggs stopped coming. And yet, the work didn't stop. Axes still broke. Doors still sagged off hinges. Hoes still cracked in frozen soil. Everyone still needed you. But no one had anything left to trade. You learned to ration, not just food, but patience. You repaired broken blades for the hope of a springtime cabbage. You patched wagon wheels in exchange for labor to be named later. You fixed a cooking pot and were told, "We'll remember you." But memory doesn't boil water, and your own family still had to eat. Some days, your shop looked less like a forge and more like a barnyard. Chickens clucking in corners, sacks of grain stuffed into the warmest corner, a pile of onions growing soft on the shelf. You learned how to store things, how to smoke meat, dry herbs, tie bundles of straw so tight they could last the season. But nothing lasted forever. The cheese molded, the grain soured, the eggs cracked. You got used to waste, to watching value rot slowly in your own home. It wasn't just demoralizing, it was dangerous, because when your income died in your hands, you couldn't replace it. And don't forget, you still owed taxes. Yes, taxes. The king didn't care that your pay came in parsnips and good intentions. He wanted silver. He wanted iron quotas. He wanted his cut, on time. And if you couldn't pay, well, you negotiated, or you begged, or you promised, like your customers did. Or, if you were lucky, the local lord forgave your debt in exchange for free work on his estate. Shoe his horses, fix his gates, reinforce the hinges on his private chapel. Protection, he called it. Honor. You called it what it was. Obligation dressed in velvet. And still, you worked. Because there was no alternative. You couldn't leave the village. The forge was fixed to the ground, and so were you. Your debts weren't just financial, they were social. You owed things to people who owed you. The entire village ran on invisible strings, and if you pulled too hard, everything collapsed. So you bent, bartered, softened your voice, even when your stomach roared. You accepted less than what you were worth. You made nails for a handful of dried peas. You crafted hinges for a sheep that never arrived. You made peace with the fact that a lifetime of skill still wasn't enough to guarantee dinner. And yet, there was a strange dignity in it, because even if you weren't rich, even if you were barely getting by, you were necessary. The village didn't move without you. Nothing opened, nothing rolled, nothing cut, churned, or turned unless you made it so. Your hands kept everything running, quietly, invisibly. You didn't own much, but you owned usefulness. And that, in a world full of hunger and cold, was something. Not everything, but something. And sometimes, on the quietest nights, when the forge had cooled and the firelight danced just enough to warm your hands, you let yourself feel it. Just a little. That without you, things would fall apart. And even if you didn't have silver in your purse, you had purpose. And that was a kind of wealth, too. You got used to the noise. You learned to live with the burns. You could handle the debt, the cold, the customers who paid with promises. But the air? That was different. You didn't see it. You didn't hear it. But you breathed it in, day after day, hour after hour. And no matter how careful you were with your hands, there was no saving your lungs. Every breath inside the forge came with a price. You just didn't know how high until it was too late. The smoke never really cleared. Even with the door open, even with the bellows resting, there was always a low haze curling near the ceiling, smelling of coal, damp ash, and something sharper you couldn't name. Sometimes you coughed, sometimes you didn't. But the tightness in your chest never quite left, and on colder days, it got worse. You told yourself it was just the weather. It wasn't. What you breathed in wasn't just smoke, it was dust. Fine, invisible particles of charcoal and iron, too small to see, too stubborn to leave. They clung to your lungs like soot to a chimney wall. Every inhale carried flecks of metal, coal ash, and something older, something heavier. Nobody warned you. Nobody could. Not because they didn't care, but because they'd breathed it too. Old blacksmiths didn't retire. They just stopped showing up. And those who lingered past their prime, you could hear it in them. The wheezing, the ragged breathing, that dry, shallow cough that came up in the silence between hammer blows. Forge fever, they called it. A catch-all term. A little sweat, a little chill, a little blood in the handkerchief. Nothing serious, until it was. There were stories of men collapsing mid-task, face first into the coals, of apprentices who never made it past their 20s, of masters who leaned too close to the fire and never stood straight again. But there were no masks, no clean air systems. Just you, the forge, and the air between. If you used charcoal, the smoke was lighter, but constant. If you used coal, it was thicker, dirtier. and with either came the carbon monoxide. You didn't know it by name. You only knew the dizziness, the way your head spun, even when you'd eaten, the fog in your thoughts, the sudden shaking of your hands. You called it fatigue, overwork. But sometimes you felt yourself drifting, mid-swing, mid-thought, like the room was tilting under your feet. Was it just a long day? Or was it the forge whispering, quietly, "I've taken enough of you now"? The irony, of course, was that heat, your greatest tool, was also your slowest killer. The forge didn't just change metal, it changed your blood. It burned oxygen faster than you could breathe it. It filled the room with gases you couldn't smell, couldn't see, and couldn't stop. And when you worked with alloys, that was another danger entirely. Not every job was iron. Sometimes it was brass, sometimes bronze, and both required copper, tin, and lead. That's when the air turned sour. The fumes didn't rise in smoke. They shimmered, thin, metallic, almost sweet. If you smelled it, it was already too late. Lead poisoning came slow. First, your fingers stopped working the way they used to. You dropped tools, missed hits. Then your knees began to shake. Then your memory turned soft. You couldn't remember if you'd quenched the blade, or if you'd already made this hinge, or whether you'd said goodbye to your daughter this morning, or if that had been yesterday. And still, you worked. Because what else could you do? No one paid you to stop. No one could see the poison settling in your bones. And it wasn't just you. Your children helped in the forge. They pumped the bellows. They swept the ash. They stood too close when they should have stood back. Their faces gray with soot before they'd lost their baby teeth. No one told them not to breathe. You tried. Maybe, once or twice. But the work had to be done, and the forge didn't care how small your lungs were. Some blacksmiths tied cloth around their mouths, a strip of linen, a sleeve torn from an old tunic. It made them feel better, safe, protected. But cloth can't stop vapor. It barely stops ash. And so, the forge took what it wanted. Not quickly, not all at once, but slowly, patiently. Your breath, your strength, your memory, your sleep. Until one morning, you woke up and realized you were no longer the man who started this job. You were a version of him, worn down from the inside out, still standing, still working, but quieter now, heavier, shorter of breath. And in those rare moments of stillness, when no one was shouting for nails and the hammer was resting cold, you'd listen to your own breathing. Soft, ragged, wet at the edges. You'd listen and you'd wonder how much of the forge had become part of you, and how much of you had already become smoke. By now, your lungs were not your own. They belonged to the forge. So did your back, your shoulders, your sleep. But if there was one thing the forge claimed most often, most loudly, it was your skin. Burns were the forge's native language, and it spoke fluently. You got used to heat, to the hiss of flesh meeting hot iron, to the sharp breath that followed, to the way pain made your vision flash white before settling into a dull, constant throb. It wasn't a matter of if, only how bad. A finger too close to a red-hot blade, a forearm brushing the edge of a tool you forgot you'd just heated, a piece of metal slipping mid-quench and splashing boiling water across your chest. And you didn't stop. Not unless the wound was deep enough to show something white beneath. Even then, you wrapped it in a rag, bit down on a leather strap, and kept working. The forge didn't pause for your pain, and neither did the town. There were treatments, of course, folk remedies, Recipes passed down with the same reverence as forging techniques. Honey mixed with ash, crushed plantain leaf, egg white and flour packed into the wound like dough. Sometimes a poultice helped. Sometimes it made things worse. But it was all you had. One 14th century medical text describes a treatment specifically for Smith's flesh: burned skin covered in soot and iron dust. The cure involved rosemary oil, duck fat, and linen soaked in spring water. You tried it once. It smelled worse than the wound. But you didn't complain, because scars were just part of the trade. A blacksmith's arms told his story: the burns, the nicks, the crescent-shaped welt from the time a glowing horseshoe bounced back off the anvil and kissed your elbow. You could trace your work history like rings in a tree, except yours were forged in blood. Your eyes weren't safe either. There were no goggles, just your brow and your instinct. Sparks flew like fireflies in the dark. Sometimes they landed harmlessly on leather. Other times they went for the eyes, tiny burning missiles hurled by hammer force. A sliver of iron in the corner of your eye could ruin your week. A full shard, moving fast enough, could blind you. And even if the forge didn't get you with flame or shrapnel, there was always the hammer. Heavy, relentless, capable of turning on you in a moment. If your swing was off, if you missed by an inch, if the tool slipped, you didn't just lose rhythm. You lost fingers, wrist bones, sometimes consciousness. The anvil was solid iron. It didn't give. If your hammer bounced wrong, the shock could climb up your arm and snap something on the way. And if the piece you were working on shifted, if the tongs failed, that red-hot iron could tumble into your lap before you had time to scream. Some blacksmiths lost toes, some lost hands, and some learned to work with one eye, one good arm, and a memory full of never again. But they worked, because there was no choice. And when the injury was worse, when it was bad enough to stop everything, there were few options. You could try to clean it, boil a blade, cut away the burned tissue, pray. Or you could cauterize, heat the same iron that hurt you and press it to the wound, seal it with fire. A scream swallowed in cloth. If infection came, the outcome was rarely kind. Wounds that should have closed opened wider, skin blackened, heat returned, not from the forge, but from the body itself. Fevers took more blacksmiths than blades ever did. And if things got bad enough, well, there were always the bone saws. You didn't go to a physician. You went to the barber, the monk, or you handed your blade to a friend and said, "Do it fast." Amputation was done without mercy or medicine. No anesthetic, just speed, heat, and something to bite. And afterward, if you survived, you didn't rest. You adapted. You learned to swing differently, to grip with the wrong hand, to hold tools with a stump wrapped in linen and leather. Because pain didn't excuse you from the forge. It simply joined you. You became a collection of adjustments, smaller motions, slower pace, a new rhythm that made space for the places you no longer had. And still, people came. They didn't notice the limp. They didn't ask about the bandages. They only said, "My wagon's broken," or "I need 6 hinges by dawn." And you said, "All right," because what else could you say? The forge didn't care that you were bleeding, and neither did the work. So you dipped your hands in water, tightened the leather over your forearms, and reached for the hammer again. And later, when the shop was quiet, when the embers had faded to orange and the pain was just a slow throb in the bone, you sat in the doorway with your back against the stone. You looked down at your arms, the old burns, the fresh ones, the way your hands trembled when they finally stopped moving. You didn't feel sorry. You didn't wish for comfort. You just wanted tomorrow to be a little slower, and for your hands to still be strong enough to hold the hammer when it came. Because it would come. It always did. You made things that could save lives. Breastplates, gauntlets, helmets with thick nose guards and reinforced cheek plates, shields rimmed in iron, swords sharpened to a line so fine it could split a hair or a man. You shaped them with precision, patience, and more than a little pain. And when they were finished, polished, and admired, you handed them over to men who would wear them, ride with them, die with them, but never wonder what it cost to make them. The irony wasn't subtle. It hit you every time you watched a knight swing his armored leg over a warhorse and trot off down the road, glinting like a god, his body wrapped in the very thing your hands had bled to shape. And you, still standing by your forge, wore nothing but soot and scars. He would enter battle protected head to toe. You, who forged that protection, would ride into the day unguarded, flinching from stray sparks and flying shards of metal with nothing more than a leather apron. There was no armor for the blacksmith, only the memory of making it. And it took time, so much time. A single suit of plate armor could take months, 3, maybe 6, depending on the design, the materials, the expectations of the noble commissioning it. Each plate had to be measured, heated, shaped over the stake again and again until it curved just right. Each rivet placed, each hinge aligned, each strap looped in ways that wouldn't chafe or slip. It wasn't just smithing, it was sculpture. One mistake, and the whole piece might bind at the elbow or fail to deflect a blade where it mattered most. And the customers? Picky, too tight at the shoulder, too much pinch behind the knee. It creaks when I move. They didn't know what it was to bend steel with nothing but a hammer and heat. They only knew it was uncomfortable. You knew what was uncomfortable. Uncomfortable was the blister that formed on your palm after 9 hours of hammering the same curve. Uncomfortable was the flick of hot scale that landed inside your boot and sizzled against the skin of your ankle while you kept working. Uncomfortable was knowing you'd made something so finely tuned, so brutally beautiful, and could never afford it yourself. A good suit of armor, custom, fitted, could cost as much as a small farm, land, livestock, a roof over your family's head. But your payment? Maybe a bag of coin. Maybe not. Maybe they'd say your taxes were forgiven this year. Maybe they'd just offer the honor of saying you forged for a knight of noble name, as if that would keep your house warm. Still, you made it, because if you didn't, someone else would. And you didn't trust other hands with work like this. Not when it might mean a man lived or died. So you pressed through the pain, the hammer blows, the aching elbow, the sweat in your eyes that made it hard to see the heat line along the metal. You folded it, flattened it, raised it again. There was no secret to armor making, only repetition, strength, and the feel of the metal under your hands, the way it rang, the way it cooled, the way it warned you when it wasn't ready. And when it was done, when the last buckle had been riveted and the final edge filed smooth, you stood back and admired it, just for a moment. Then you turned it over to the man who would wear it, and he didn't know you. Didn't see the scar on your forearm from the splinter of metal that shot off on day 3. Didn't see how your right shoulder sagged lower than your left from months of leaning over the stake, didn't know you'd burned through 3 pairs of tongs and nearly passed out twice from heat exhaustion shaping the breastplate. He didn't ask. He just nodded. Maybe offered a coin. Maybe not. Then he strapped on your work and walked away. And you watched. Not with resentment, but with a strange, hollow quiet. Because you knew the truth. Armor looked noble, but it was born in fire, and it was paid for in flesh long before the battlefield ever saw it. Sometimes in the late hours, when your forge glowed low and your hands were too stiff to fold, you looked at the scrap, the offcuts of steel, the twisted tongs, the malformed helm that cracked mid-forming and had to be discarded. You wondered what kind of armor you'd make for yourself if you had the time, the materials, the right measurements. Maybe something light, something that covered the hands, the lungs, the back of the neck where the burn still hadn't healed. Maybe something you'd never have to take off, but there was no time. Another order always came, and you didn't forge for yourself, you forged for others. So you stood up, rolled your shoulder, wrapped your fingers around the hammer one more time, and wondered, not what you'd make next, but who would wear it. You didn't really sleep, not properly, not deeply, because even when the forge went cold and your hammer hung in silence, the work didn't end. It only paused, briefly, carefully, until someone knocked on your door again, and they always knocked. A broken gate, a snapped chain, a cartwheel that lost its rim halfway down the hill, a farmer's plow that wouldn't hold steady in the soil, a horse that limped into your yard with one shoe dangling and 3 more barely holding on. No matter the hour, no matter the day, someone needed you. Holidays didn't apply to your hands. The church might close its doors on a holy day, but your workshop stayed lit, because broken iron didn't care about saints, and the harvest couldn't wait until Sunday passed. There were dispensations, of course. Church records in some towns list blacksmiths as essential. That meant you were granted divine permission to keep working on feast days, not because God was merciful, but because no one else could fix the mill wheel in time. So you stayed up, worked by candlelight, let your fingers stiffen in the cold, and your knees lock into place as you braced a rod for one more strike, one more fix, one more favor that someone absolutely needed before morning. You didn't keep a schedule. The forge decided when the day began. The village decided when it ended. And when war came, it was worse. Soldiers didn't care if your hands were raw, if the armor order was behind, if your apprentice had burned himself and you hadn't yet treated the wound. They just told you to work faster. Some blacksmiths were forced to march with armies, not as fighters, but as mobile workshops, dragging portable anvils behind them, repairing swords in the middle of camp, mending chainmail while arrows whistled past the tents. Your battlefield wasn't the front line. It was wherever something broke. And in a world where metal meant survival, that was everywhere. Sometimes you missed entire seasons, missed weddings, missed funerals, missed your child's first steps because the Baron's carriage axle cracked just before a journey, and he couldn't possibly be late. "I'll pay you double," he said. You never saw the second half. And even when the war stopped, even when the soldiers returned with cracked blades and dented helms and missing limbs, you were still expected to be ready, to repair what was broken, to make whole what others had shattered. But they didn't see it that way. They thought you were lucky, to have work, to be needed, as if being indispensable was the same as being respected, as if fixing their damage didn't damage you in return. You became the village's beating heart, always pumping, never stopping. And when something failed, They didn't ask what happened. They asked if you had done it right the first time. The burden wasn't just iron, it was blame. When a sword broke in combat, the soldier cursed the smith. When a gate rusted after a year of rain, the merchant questioned your skill. When a scythe snapped mid-harvest, the farmer claimed your work had cost him his crop. No one mentioned misuse, neglect, weather, accidents. Just you. You who had told them not to store the plow in the mud. Who warned them the hinge was only meant for doors, not livestock pens. Who begged them not to overburden the cart. They didn't listen. And when it failed, they remembered your name, not for your craft, but for your supposed mistake. Sometimes it went further. There are records, quiet ones, buried in legal ledgers, of blacksmiths hauled before local lords, accused of sabotage, of poor workmanship, of deliberate defect. They were made to swear oaths before relics, before saints' bones, before crowds of angry clients. I did not weaken the blade. I did not curse the gate. I did not forge with evil intent, as if they were criminals, not craftsmen. But the worst moments didn't come in public. They came alone, when a child injured themselves with a tool you made, when a horse fell on a slick road and they said the shoe was to blame, when a wagon overturned and the axle cracked just where your brand had been stamped. You told yourself it wasn't your fault. You reminded yourself how carefully you'd forged it, how hard you'd worked, how little time they gave you. But still, it followed you. Every broken piece, every splintered edge, every sharp silence in the village square when you passed by, and when your time came, when the hammer finally slipped from your hand for the last time, there were no great songs sung, no monuments, no stained glass windows bearing your name, just a small grave, a few tools buried beside you, maybe a burned scrap of leather that still held the shape of your palm. In your final days, you might have asked for forgiveness, not because you had sinned, but because you feared that somewhere, something you made had failed, and someone else had paid the price. That was the blacksmith's burden, not just labor, not just exhaustion, but the quiet, unshakable knowledge that your work had weight. And that weight, unlike the sword or the wheel, didn't leave when the work was done. It stayed. And now the forge is quiet. The coals have cooled to ash. The hammer lies still. Outside, the village has gone dark, not with fear, just sleep. Even the wind seems to tiptoe tonight, brushing gently across the shuttered windows and empty streets. Inside, the tools are right where you left them, tongs resting on the bench, the bucket of water calm and still, reflecting the last glow of ember light. Your apron hangs like a shadow on the wall, and the anvil, your oldest companion, sits silent, holding nothing for the first time in days. Your hands ache, but less now. They remember the work, but they no longer chase it. The fire inside your chest, once stoked with every breath, has softened to a warm flicker, steady, quiet. You sit for a while, not to plan the next job, not to wait for the next knock, but just to be still, to let the heat fade from your skin and the noise fade from your bones. And maybe, just maybe, you finally feel what the metal must feel when it's taken from the fire and left to cool in peace. You are not forgotten. The things you made remain. The wheels that roll, the gates that hold, the armor that gleams. And though your name may not be carved in stone, your hands shaped the world, quietly, firmly, without praise. Now, there is nothing more to carry. Let the weight drop from your shoulders. Let the warmth settle into your spine. Let the sound of the forge become memory, and memory become sleep. Good night, Smith. You've done enough.